Homage to the root teacher Buddha Shakyamuni. Homage to the wisdom warrior Manjushri. Homage to all the benevolent lineage masters. The supreme Dharma, infinitely profound and subtle, is rarely encountered, even in millions of kalpas. Now we are able to hear, study, and follow it. May we fully realize the Tathagata's true meaning. In order to liberate all sentient beings from samsara, please generate the supreme bodhicitta. Next, let's continue our study. We come now to the second of the 5 individual advantages, the advantage of place. The amount of content I teach from the preliminaries in each class is not very long. Each day's class is not very long because we need time to reflect on the teachings thoroughly. These teachings are different from the more theoretical Dharma texts. Those texts focus mainly on the meaning of the Dharma, understood through debate, discussion, and analysis. The preliminary practices, by contrast, require earnest contemplation, followed by actual meditation. So these teachings on the preliminaries may take somewhat longer. I think that if a teaching is delivered too quickly, people do not have time to contemplate. And without contemplation, it is very difficult to gain genuine benefit in one's mind. So as we work through these preliminary teachings together, I ask for your patience. I hope you will not develop aversion or boredom. Ordinary beings tend to chase after novelty. They get excited when there is a new teaching today, and yet another one tomorrow. When a single teaching continues for a long time, they often start to feel reluctant to listen. We must be very mindful of this tendency. And there is another point I want to mention. I hope you will take advantage of this rare opportunity and do your best to listen to and study the teachings thoroughly. The content presented here may differ somewhat from previous teachings on the preliminaries. Due to time constraints, some masters have simply recited the texts at speed, almost like giving an oral transmission, reading the words aloud but not explaining them. It is very difficult to grasp the profound meanings this way. So I personally feel that whether we are listening to the Dharma or teaching it, we must take the time to go through it slowly and carefully. When we read a teaching passage and reflect on it again and again, becoming familiarized with its meaning through repetition, something shifts inside us. I think this human life is incredibly precious, especially when we have the fortune to encounter such profound and authentic Dharma. So we should study it carefully and thoroughly, from start to finish. To those engaged in the study, please do not get disenchanted. Persevere, as this opportunity is rare. As the teacher, I made this aspiration at the beginning, and I hope to maintain it until the end. Otherwise, what would happen? At the beginning, I might spend a whole class on just a few lines, but by the end, I would rush through several pages at once, almost like giving an oral transmission. And with that, I would simply say, all right, that is enough for today, but there is nothing to rush through. If we can spend our lives immersed in an atmosphere of listening, contemplating, and meditating on the Dharma, that itself is a profound kind of happiness. There are many kinds of happiness in the world, but for me personally, the greatest happiness comes from listening to and teaching the Dharma. I feel this sincerely. Many other worldly activities have no lasting meaning. And I have observed that many of you also place listening to and studying the Dharma above all other activities. So I hope all of you will listen with a strong sense of yearning and eagerness. Today we will discuss being born in the central land, which is part of what we call a favorable environment. Let me explain in detail what exactly the central land means. It can be classified into 2 categories: the geographic central land and the central land of the Dharma. First, let us look at the geographic central land. This refers to the Vajra Seat in central India, at the heart of Jambudvipa. It is the sacred site where all 1,000 Buddhas of this fortunate Kalpa attain enlightenment. It remains untouched by the destructive forces of the 4 great elements. Even during an empty Kalpa, when everything else is destroyed, the Vajra Seat remains intact. It simply stays, like a barrel suspended in the air. At the center of the Vajra Seat stands a magnificent Bodhi tree, adorning the sacred ground. As I have mentioned before, the term Jambudvipa, also known as the Rose Apple Land, the name for our continent in Buddhist cosmology, has been interpreted in different ways in various historical accounts. Some interpret Jambudvipa as referring to the entire world. Other scholars interpret it as the whole of Asia. And in yet another interpretation, the term refers specifically to India. In the context of the text we are studying, Jambudvipa means India, and more precisely, central India. According to some historians, there are different accounts of the precise location of the Vajra Seat in India. However, nowadays people generally refer to it as the place where the Buddha attained enlightenment. That is, Bodh Gaya. Bodh Gaya is located in central India. Hence it is called the Vajra Seat of central India. This Vajra Seat is the great sacred site where all 1,000 Buddhas of this fortunate Kalpa will attain enlightenment. Why is the Vajra Seat known as the Vajra Seat? According to the great Tang records on the western regions, this is where the 1,000 Buddhas would eventually enter the Vajra Samadhi. There, they would eliminate two types of obscurations, the afflictive obscurations and the cognitive obscurations. These pervade the three realms. By eliminating them entirely, they would achieve complete enlightenment. Because they entered the Vajra Samadhi at this location, it became known as the Vajra Seat. That is one of the meanings embedded in the term. And furthermore, even during the Kalpa of destruction, the Vajra Seat remains untouched and undamaged. As I just mentioned, it stays suspended in empty space like a barrel hanging in midair. According to some teachings of Jigme Lingpa, the great Nyingma master, there was once a sage named Dadhichi who practiced virtue and meditative concentration for an extraordinarily long time. The name means one who drinks yogurt. It is a Sanskrit name. When the great sage Dadhichi was approaching death, he made an aspiration that all of his bones would transform into diamond, the hardest known substance in the world. Through the power of his virtuous deeds and meditative concentration, after he passed away, his skeleton was completely transformed into diamond. At that time, the celestial gods took his body up to the heavens and divided it among themselves. Indra fashioned a sword from the sage's leg bones. Maheshvara made a spear from his rib bones. And Vishnu crafted a precious wheel from his hip bones. In the process of making their respective weapons, a great deal of diamond dust fell to earth. Perhaps it was much like a factory today, where a great deal of diamond dust falls as the work goes on. That diamond dust came to rest in what is now central India, accumulating in a formation shaped like a barrel, with the indestructible diamond base below and the earth above, forming the Vajra Seat, according to the great Tang records on the western regions, written by the pilgrim monk Xuanzang during his famous journey. This sacred site extends roughly 100 paces in circumference. Because the Vajra Seat is made of indestructible diamond, even when the Kalpa of destruction comes, it remains untouched. That is the explanation for the Vajra Seat. When I was studying the words of my perfect teacher, I often wondered, why is the Vajra Seat not destroyed? During the Kalpa of destruction, the entire grand trichiliocosm is completely annihilated. Why is this spot still suspended in space? Because it is made of Vajra diamond, the most indestructible material. We know that when the gods do battle with the demigods, Indra's weapons are capable of completely destroying the weapons of the demigods. However, when the demigods retaliate with their weapons, they cannot damage Indra's weapons at all. This shows just how indestructible these materials are. The aspirational power of the sage Dadhichi is also behind the Vajra Seat's indestructibility. We learn from the teachings on the Bardo, the intermediate state between death and rebirth, that the consciousness in that state can pass through virtually anything. Yet it cannot pass through the womb or the Vajra Seat of India. Aside from these two exceptions, the consciousness in that state can penetrate any other material in the world without obstruction, whether mountains, rivers, the earth, or everything in between. The womb cannot be penetrated because of the karmic force of sentient beings. Once they enter the womb, they are unable to leave. This is connected to karmic force. As for the Vajra Seat, its impenetrability is due to the aspirational power of the sage Dadhichi. That is why the Bardo body can penetrate everything except the womb and the Vajra Seat. Now, some people may think, does this mean the Vajra Seat is eternal and will never be destroyed? Not quite. Eternal here simply means an extraordinarily long span of time. Perhaps it will remain intact for a few great kalpas. But that does not mean it is truly eternal or permanent. If something were permanent and without beginning, it could never have come into existence in the first place. Yet apart from these most extraordinary materials, even the toughest substances in the ordinary world, after a few hundred or a few thousand years, will all eventually deteriorate and collapse. When we talk with construction teams today about the quality standards for a Dharma hall, they will say a concrete structure can perhaps last 50 or 100 years, but no contractor would dare guarantee it will last 200 years. The quality of many building materials today is simply not durable enough. The moment they are exposed to the forces of earth, water, fire, or wind, they can be destroyed instantly. So from all of this, we can appreciate that India's Vajra Seat is a unique and extraordinary sacred site. Furthermore, the 1,000 Buddhas of this fortunate kalpa all attain enlightenment there. The first 4 Buddhas of this fortunate kalpa have already attained enlightenment at the Vajra Seat in India, including Buddha Shakyamuni. From Buddha Maitreya onwards, a further 996 Buddhas will attain enlightenment in the same place. In the aspiration prayer text, the aspiration, essence of the ocean, composed by our precious Guru Jigme Phuntsok Rinpoche at the Vajra Seat in India, there are these key lines, rendered here in translation. In the future, when the 996 great guides, these aspiration verses continue. When the Buddhas manifest to attain enlightenment in this realm, may I always follow and attend them as their supreme attendant. May I attain the power to spread their magnificent activities far and wide. When the future 996 Buddhas come to attain enlightenment here, may I become an attendant of each, spreading their great activities. That is roughly what these verses are aspiring to. According to this aspiration made by our Guru, there are still 996 Buddhas who will attain enlightenment at the Vajra Seat in India. So when we make aspirations every day, we also aspire to attain enlightenment there. If we can attain the fruit of a noble being before that, of course that would be wonderful. And once we do, we aspire to listen to the Dharma in the presence of each of those Buddhas and to serve as their attendants. That is how we should aspire. Every December, many revered masters from Tibet gather at the Vajra Seat in India, especially eminent masters of the Nyingma lineage, and they host a great Monlam ceremony, a grand gathering for making aspirations. This takes place every year. So in the future, all of you, when you make a pilgrimage to India, please don't forget to visit the Vajra Seat at Bodh Gaya. Some people had already gone and came back with a Bodhi leaf as an offering for me. One person said, I secretly brought back this Bodhi leaf to offer to you. The Indian government protects the Bodhi tree, so you are not allowed to pick the leaves casually. So how did these Dharma friends get them? They secretly found a way. Sometimes people will wait beneath the tree for an entire day, especially in autumn when the wind blows and the leaves start to fall. As soon as a leaf drops, several people rush to grab it. This is the very place where all 1,000 Buddhas of this fortunate kalpa will attain enlightenment. That sacred zone of about 100 paces is India's Vajra Seat. This is also the precise spot where Buddha Shakyamuni himself actually attained Buddhahood. There stands a magnificent Bodhi tree. Now, as I may have mentioned, this Bodhi tree is not the original one under which the Buddha sat. Its history has gone through several distinct phases, each remarkable in its own right. The first part was when King Ashoka, before he turned to Buddhism, was influenced by non-Buddhist views. He tried to burn the Bodhi tree, but several miracles occurred. The Bodhi tree thrived in the flames and showed many auspicious signs. Later he gained faith and nourished it with milk. So, the first time, the Bodhi tree was completely restored. The second time, because King Ashoka had developed great faith in the Bodhi tree after he turned to the Dharma, he went there every day to pay his respects and make offerings. His queen consort frequently asked the ministers, "Where has King Ashoka gone?" Each time the answer was, "He has gone to the Bodhi tree." The queen became annoyed by his constant devotion. She sent people to cut it down, but when they started cutting, numerous auspicious signs appeared. She then felt deep remorse and performed a purification. Then the queen also poured milk over the roots of the tree, and it gradually recovered. Later, during the reign of a king after Ashoka, some adverse circumstances arose and the tree was damaged again. Eventually, Ashoka's daughter brought a branch of the Bodhi tree all the way to Sri Lanka, to a sacred Buddhist site there, and planted it. After it was planted, it took root and grew beautifully. After taking root in Sri Lanka, it flourished there over the centuries. But back in India, when Islamic invasion swept through, the original Bodhi tree was completely destroyed. Afterwards, branches from the Sri Lankan tree were brought back to India and replanted at the sacred Vajra Seat. They grew into the tree we know today. This is the process by which the current Bodhi tree came to be. But in a deeper sense, it is a continuation of the original tree, and the lineage of the tree has never truly been broken. The Bodhi tree is mentioned in many scriptures and commentaries, each describing its numerous and extraordinary merits. When you see it, bodhicitta naturally arises. When you come near it, great loving kindness and compassion well up in your heart. Many virtues and blessings have been described. So let us now understand what the text is mainly introducing here. The Vajra Seat in India, as explained earlier, is what is called the geographic central land. Why is it called the geographic central land? Because 1,000 Buddhas of this fortunate Kalpa attained Buddhahood right there. It is no ordinary place. It is the geographic central land, the sacred sites centered on the Vajra Seat in India. All the major cities across India are also called the geographic central land. Places such as Sarnath, Vaishali, and Rajgir. The Vinaya enumerates the 6 great cities of India. All of these cities, centered on the 6 great cities, are designated as the geographic central land. From this point of view, both the Tibetan and Chinese regions are considered border regions on a geographical level, because neither is a place where the Buddha attained enlightenment. Those Indian sacred sites are the geographic central land. Second, the central land of the Dharma refers to a place where the true Dharma of Buddhism actually exists. This means the Dharma of scripture and the Dharma of realization, especially the teaching and expounding of the Dharma and the study, contemplation, and practice of it. The place where the true life force of Buddhism exists is where Buddhism is said to exist. Of course, there are various opinions on this. Some say Buddhism exists wherever the Sutra of immeasurable life can be found. Others say it exists wherever there are monasteries. But can we call that the presence of Buddhism? True Buddhism consists of hearing, contemplation, and practice. Just having scriptures sitting somewhere does not constitute a Buddhist central land. Imagine a city where no one has genuine faith in Buddhism, or where such faith is only nominal. Even if there are several copies of the Diamond Sutra or the Sutra of Immeasurable Life sitting on shelves in that city, could we call it a central land of Buddhism? I think that would be very difficult to claim. A place where the Dharma of realization and the Dharma of scripture have always flourished without decline is the central land of Buddhism. A place without the Dharma is called a border region. Throughout the entire period when the Buddha lived and taught in this world, India was considered to be both the geographic central land and the central land of the Dharma. From the time of the Buddha's enlightenment, India has always been the geographic central land of Buddhism. There is no question about that. The entire subcontinent, especially the Vajra Seat at Bodh Gaya, is the geographic central land. However, it is said that for a long period, the Vajra Seat was taken over by followers of non-Buddhist traditions. Buddhism had almost completely vanished. It had almost become a border region. From a purely geographical point of view, not much has changed. The location is the same. Although India is geographically the central land, from a Dharma perspective, the situation was very different. Even during the lifetime of Patrul Rinpoche, who passed away in 1889, the Vajra Seat had already been taken over by followers of non-Buddhist traditions, and Buddhism had nearly vanished. It was almost becoming a border region rather than the central land. When I visited India in the 1990s, the locals said that about 50 years earlier, Buddhism there had been destroyed by Islamic forces, and the Vajra Seat had been under British control for approximately 50 years. Later, it was eventually handed back to the Indian government. That is what some accounts say. However, people at the time had no reliable historical records to verify this. But it is clear that India was indeed under Islamic occupation during that period. Later, Gendun Chofhel's travelogue, Grains of Gold, also mentions a lay practitioner named Dharmapala. Dharmapala risked his very life to restore many of the remaining Buddhist temples and stupas at the sacred Vajra Seat in Bodh Gaya. Before all this restoration began, the destruction that Islamic occupation had brought upon Buddhism was devastating, a terrible blow in history. At the Buddhist Museum in Sarnath, for example, you can see that all the Buddha statues were mutilated, with heads and hands completely destroyed. Dharmapala also worked to restore the great Mahabodhi stupa and many other Buddha statues at places like Sarnath. These restoration efforts continue to this day. At that time, Islamic armies inflicted tremendous damage on Buddhism. It was devastating. The scale of destruction was comparable to what happened during the Cultural Revolution in Tibet and China. The harm done to Buddhism during that time was terrifying. Nowadays, some people talk about how good things are, but older people who lived through that era should know in their hearts what actually happened. In Tibet alone, thousands of monasteries were essentially wiped out. All the Buddha statues were thrown into rivers, and the scriptures were burned. In my own hometown, and I remember this myself, all the monastics were forced to return to lay life. The Dharma halls were burned down. As for the monks' quarters, nothing remained but crumbling walls. When I was very young, I would go there to herd yaks. I would spend time at those old ruins, digging under the walls with my hands or with a hoe, hoping to find some remnants. Once I came across a damaged tanka among the ruins, and I was completely overjoyed. I exclaimed out loudly and happily carried it home. But my family immediately scolded me. They even hit me. They said, "Don't shout. Don't you know how serious things are?" I had been yelling it. A distance from home, I found a Buddha image. My whole family was terrified, since the neighbors might have heard. In those times, something like that could bring extremely serious trouble. Regardless of the period in history, the destruction of Buddhism in India by non-Buddhist forces remains terrifying to behold. Buddhism was not flourishing in India at that time. It had almost died out during the period of Islamic rule. In fact, Buddhism is now flourishing again in India, and this is largely thanks to the many great masters from Tibet, who went into exile in India in the 1950s, after the political changes in Tibet. There they began building monasteries and training monastics and scholars. Their sole focus was propagating and preserving the Dharma. So the revival of Mahayana Buddhism across India is largely the work of these Tibetan masters, and even the Indians themselves acknowledge this wholeheartedly. Tibetan Buddhism has brought new life and richness to the entire Dharma landscape of India. Separately, a small number of Theravada monks from Sri Lanka and Myanmar also came to India to spread their tradition. Original Buddhism in India, the land of its birth, has essentially disappeared from its homeland. The sacred sites that remain have been taken over by Islamic groups and other religious communities. Conflicts between religious groups there are extremely intense. You may have seen the reports. Temples burned down, followers of one group fighting against another. These things continue even now. Among native Indians, not many follow the teachings of our root teacher Buddha Shakyamuni. Even at the Vajra Seat at Bodh Gaya and at Sarnath, those who have made a pilgrimage there can see that Local Indians rarely come to venerate or make offerings. So many Tibetan masters have very few Indian patrons. Their supporters mostly travel from places like Taiwan, America, or other countries to make offerings. That is roughly the current state of Buddhism in India today, its birthplace. Despite the distance and closed-off nature of Tibet, Patrul Rinpoche was nonetheless aware of what was happening in India. He concluded that India had essentially become a border region and that the Dharma had almost vanished there. The following section will now introduce the Tibetan snowland plateau. How did Buddhism come to flourish in Tibet? How did it decline? Everyone present here should understand this history clearly. Some of you may not feel Tibetan history is especially important, but I think it is worth knowing, because today, books and documentaries on Tibetan Buddhism mix in various outside perspectives and extraneous factors. We will not go into those here. What matters most for us as practitioners is the history of Buddhism itself, and that is something we should care about. For example, I was born on the Tibetan snowland plateau, and that history is my own. But I am also very interested in the history of Chinese Buddhism. For example, the history of the Pure Land School and its renowned masters. What was that actually like? And the Chan School and the Tiantai School? Whenever I visit a monastery, I spend time talking with the abbot at length. Who was the great master who founded this monastery? How many years ago? What has its history been since then? I want to know all of this. By learning from the histories and experiences of others, we bring great benefit to our own mind stream. There is so much to learn from these stories. So here we need to examine, is the Tibetan snowland a border region, or is it a central land? From a purely geographical point of view, it is certainly a border region. That much is clear. But from the Dharma perspective, is it a border region or a central land? That is what we need to think about carefully. Historically, the Tibetan snowland has an extraordinary past. At the time the Buddha appeared in India, very few humans lived in the Tibetan snowland. The Buddha also prophesied in the relevant scriptures that in the land of the red-faced Rakshasas, the lakes will gradually disappear in the future, and after humans are born, the Dharma will be spread there. There are many records of this. So basically, there were hardly any human beings at that time, and the Dharma had not yet been able to flourish in the land of Tibet. So it was commonly called the border region of Tibet. In references by Lord Atisha and in the great biography of the great master Padmasambhava, it is often said, "You people of the border region of Tibet, and you are in the land of hungry ghosts." There are numerous such statements. So at that time, Tibet could be regarded as a border region where the Dharma had not flourished at all. However, human beings eventually began to increase. According to legend, the Tibetan people originated from the union of Master Monkey, who was an emanation of Avalokiteshvara and a Rakshasa woman. Of course, there are many versions of this story throughout history, but this is not a history lesson. When it comes to these historical matters, I do have quite a bit to share. Because when I was studying at the Teachers Training Institute, I majored in Tibetan language and literature. Back then, I was immersed in Tibetan history every single day, reading and studying all the various historical accounts. I developed quite a thorough familiarity with that material, and I was fascinated by it. That is how we are. Our interests naturally shift at different ages. When I was young, I wanted to know everything about history, Brahmanavada, that is, Buddhist logic, and poetry. But now, I just want to focus on learning more about practice. Still, it is good to have some general knowledge of human history. These days, there are many videos, documentaries, and books offering extensive introductions to the Tibetan snowland. Some content is quite good, but sometimes it goes too far, because some of the scholars and journalists who produce them do not understand the very profound principles of Buddhism. When they encounter something with depth, they reinterpret it through their own worldview, and this distorts the original meaning. So whether you are watching television or viewing video productions made nowadays, the historical narrative about Buddhism is not always accurate. As Buddhists, we often find historical accounts by non-Buddhist scholars or journalists to be seriously misleading. Later, many kings and ministers appeared who were themselves embodiments of enlightened beings. They arose on the Tibetan plateau, one after another, to spread the Dharma and liberate sentient beings. If you read through the long history of Tibet, you will find its historical evolution is different from that of other regions. What makes it different? In other places, whether in politics, military affairs, science, or culture, in many respects there are similarities, and the differences are not all that great. But in terms of benefiting sentient beings and spreading the Dharma, that is where the differences become significant. Contrary to modern performances that portray King Songtsen Gampo slaughtering yaks, where you see all sorts of dramatic interpretations from actors, that simply is not how it was. Historically, when we look at the actual records, the Tibetan kings of different generations were committed to propagating the Dharma. I will not talk about other things, but when it comes to propagating the Dharma, I am very grateful. In the early period of Tibet, the accounts vary. First, according to Tibetan historical records, there were 7 heavenly kings called the Tri-Kings, followed by 6 earthly kings called the Lek Kings. In the middle, there were 8 groups of kings, and at the end there were 5 great kings, and so on, bringing the total lineage to 28 generations. According to some historical accounts, King Lha-Thothori is regarded as the embodiment of the Bodhisattva Samantabhadra. During the time of King Lha-Thothori Nyantsen, the Sutra of Confession with 100 prostrations, miniature molds of sacred stupas, and other such objects. These objects of the 3 jewels descended from the sky and landed on the royal palace. This symbolized the very beginning of the Dharma in Tibet and is considered Buddhism's origin. However, there are different accounts of this. For instance, according to the Red Annals and related histories, the sacred objects of the 3 jewels appeared along with sunlight above the king's palace, amazing the king and his ministers. They looked at the sutra, but none of them had any idea what it was about. Then a beautiful voice came from the sky, saying, "You don't understand now, but you must venerate these supports of the 3 jewels with a pure heart. After 5 generations, you will be able to comprehend the scripture." After this prophecy, the king treated them as very profound and mysterious objects. He venerated them and made offerings. There is also such a statement. In Dudjom Rinpoche's The Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism, it is mentioned that the story about objects descending onto the palace is a Bonpo account that does not hold up. The true story is as follows. At that time, 2 pandits arrived from India with a translator. They carried the sutra of the jewel chest and the gold stupa of the 6-syllable mantra, as well as other objects of the 3 jewels. They personally presented these sacred objects to the king and told him, "After 5 more generations, you will understand their meanings." Of course, there are different versions of this account, but regardless of the details, what is universally accepted in Tibet is that the reign of King Lha-Thothori Nyantsen marks the very beginning of Buddhism's entry into Tibet. At that time, only the sacred objects of the 3 jewels were kept in the royal palace. This palace still stands near Lhasa, and the ruins of Lha-Thothori's palace still exist today. The era of King Lha-Thothori was probably around the Eastern Jin dynasty in China. In Tibet, there may be different accounts. In the history of Buddhism in India, composed by Taranatha of the Jonang tradition, it says that King Lha-Thothori and Vasubandhu were from the same period. I remember it being documented that way. But Gendun Chopel says in the White Annals that Vasubandhu's disciple Dignaga, the great logician, was a contemporary of Songtsen Gampo. If that is the case, then the gap in time between Vasubandhu and Lha-Thothori becomes rather large. Different Tibetan historical texts give differing accounts on these timelines. But regardless of the specific dates, the reign of Lha-Thothori Nyantsen must have been well before the Tang dynasty. So King Lha-Thothori should be placed in a relatively early period of history. He is said to have ascended the throne at the age of 13. Later, at the age of 60, he received the sacred objects of the 3 jewels. Through the power of those blessings, he is said to have regained the appearance of a 16-year-old and lived for another 60 years. He is said to have passed away at the age of 120. Lha-Thothori Nyantsen is one of the most remarkable kings in all of Tibetan history. According to the prophecy, after 5 generations, someone would fully comprehend the meaning of those scriptures. Now, we come to the great Dharma king, Songtsen Gampo, who was a true manifestation of the greatly compassionate Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, appearing as a king. Among his ministers, 2 were extraordinary. The first was Thönmi Sambhota. He was dispatched to India at the age of 13 or 15, according to some accounts. Many who traveled with him reached Nepal but could not bear the climate. Many died, and others turned back and fled. Eventually, Thönmi Sambhota made it all the way to India. There he studied under the master Vajra Seat, considered the foremost of all Indian pandits, at least as the Tibetans see it. There Thönmi Sambhota studied both Pramanavada, that is, Buddhist logic and epistemology, and grammar. The Indian writing system originally had 50 vowel letters. From these, Thönmi Sambhota carefully made his selections and added 6 additional letters to suit the sounds of the Tibetan language. In total, this gave the Tibetan script 30 consonants. Previously, Tibet had no written language of its own, and with this achievement, the long era in which Tibet had no writing finally came to an end. He created the unprecedented Tibetan script. Thönmi Sambhota is therefore regarded as the creator of the Tibetan script. Some histories say that Thönmi Sambhota was an emanation of Manjushri. Nowadays, many young Tibetans have very little understanding of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas because of their education. In many schools, the life stories of Buddha Shakyamuni, Manjushri, or Avalokiteshvara are basically not taught at all. The young people simply do not know them. All they know are works attributed to Thönmi Sambhota, texts like the 30 verses on Tibetan grammar and other linguistic treatises. So today in Tibet, there is enormous faith and reverence for Thönmi Sambhota. Many teachers and younger intellectuals consider Thönmi Sambhota to be, in their hearts, like Buddha Shakyamuni himself. This is happening even now. Not long ago, someone declared that Buddha images could not be hung in certain schools because they were government schools, and children should not have religious faith. But many teachers responded, images of Thönmi Sambhota should be allowed. Many teachers from different schools began debating this matter. Some even tried to argue with high-ranking officials. The officials declared, this cannot be allowed. Thönmi Sambhota is a Buddha or Bodhisattva, so his image cannot be hung in a government school. Then someone responded, in that case, images of Confucius and Mencius should not be hung either, since they too are considered emanations of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. After much back and forth, the conclusion was that images of Thönmi Sambhota, Confucius, and Mencius can all be displayed. In some schools, this discussion went on and on. So many young people now wear images of Thönmi Sambhota around their necks. I have visited several university lecturers and high school teachers who all have his image hanging above their beds with incense burning in front. It is just like people in southern China who have profound devotion to Avalokiteshvara or Guanyin in Chinese. If Thönmi Sambhota had not created the Tibetan script, Tibet would have been in a truly difficult and unfortunate situation. Thönmi Sambhota traveled all the way to India and endured many austerities. After creating the Tibetan script, when he returned and stood before the king, he said, "O king, you are like the sun, and your ministers and followers surround you like countless stars. But among them all, no minister has contributed as much to human civilization as I have." He sang this with pride and conviction, and the king was filled with gratitude toward him. There is quite a lot more to say about this. In any case, At that time, Thönmi Sambhota created the Tibetan script. Later, because he had received authentic Dharma from India, King Songtsen Gampo requested many teachings directly from Thönmi Sambhota. Together, they translated 21 sutras and tantras related to Avalokiteshvara, such as the 11-faced Avalokiteshvara Sutra, the Lotus Sutra, and the White Lotus Sutra, among others. These are all related to the sutras, like the Dharani Sutra of 11-faced Avalokiteshvara, the Dharani Tantra of the 1,000-armed, 1,000-eyed Avalokiteshvara, and so forth. All these were translated at that time. There were also what they called esoteric and mysterious objects, namely the Sutra of the Jewel Chest and the 6-syllable mantra. People at that time considered them deeply profound and sacred, too mysterious to fully understand, and so that name stuck. These too were translated into Tibetan. This was during the reign of King Songtsen Gampo. Later, relying on the king's great miraculous powers and on Minister Gartongsen's adaptive strategies to protect the nation, King Songtsen Gampo married Princess Wencheng of the Tang dynasty in China. He also took Princess Brikuti of Nepal as his consort. At that time, Gartongsen, that minister, was a figure many of you probably know well. He was extraordinarily resourceful, the most capable of all the king's ministers. In Tibet, everyone has their own version of stories about him, so I certainly cannot finish telling them today. Let us set them aside for now. And I will say, Samye, you should really look into the story of how he went to Emperor Tang Taizong, the great Tang dynasty emperor. Emperor Taizong presented him with one difficult challenge after another. When Gartongsen reached Nepal, he also encountered many difficulties. But from a young age, he had been exceptionally brilliant, capable in everything he undertook, and the king relied on him deeply. At that time in Tibet, whether it was military affairs, economic matters, national defense, or many other concerns, all of these were managed by Gartongsen. So in terms of the Dharma, Thönmi Sambhota's merit was immense. And from a worldly perspective, Gartongsen was formidable. His abilities were remarkable. Now, both of these princesses were emanations of Tara. Princess Brikuti of Nepal was an emanation of wrathful Tara, and Princess Wencheng of the Tang dynasty was an emanation of peaceful Tara. They were both brought to Tibet as the king's consorts. At the same time, they each brought with them precious statues that stand as representatives of our root teacher, Buddha Shakyamuni, one depicting him at age 8 and one at age 12. Many objects of the 3 jewels were brought to Tibet, including the most precious statue of Buddha Shakyamuni in China. The Jowo Buddha statue was originally enshrined in the Chinese imperial palace as a sacred object of the 3 jewels. Because Princess Wencheng had a strong faith in the 3 jewels, the statue was brought to Tibet. The history of the time was very complex, and Gartongsen was extremely wise in dealing with all kinds of challenges. There are many stories about him, but I won't go into them here. Some even say that the reason Songtsen Gampo married Princess Wencheng was simply to obtain the Jowo Buddha statue. But there are many claims of this sort. In any case, this statue, now in the Jokang temple, was directly blessed and consecrated by Buddha Shakyamuni himself. It is considered a world treasure. The Nepalese statue is an 8-year-old Buddha statue from the royal palace. They were placed separately, one in the Jokang temple and one in the Ramoche temple. And King Songtsen Gampo built many temples, including the Jokang temple in Lhasa, the Thadol temple, the Yangdul temple, and a considerable number of others. From that time onward, the formal path of genuine Dharma was officially established in Tibet. So during the reign of King Songtsen Gampo, many temples, both large and small, began to be built. The Jokang and Ramoche temples, among the greatest in all of Tibet, were also constructed at this time. The Jokang temple was particularly significant for all of Tibet. Great masters with visionary perception during that time had observed that the topography of Tibet resembled the shape of a reclining demoness lying face up across the land. The Jokang temple was to be built right on her chest, At that location there was a large lake. If that lake was not covered over and filled in, the Dharma in Tibet would face many challenges and obstacles in the future. But to fill in the lake, a goat would have to transport enormous amounts of soil from distant sources. This goat is said to have been an emanation of a bodhisattva. It carried the soil all the way from great distances. Even today, in areas like Drango and elsewhere in Tibet, there are many places associated with Gar Tongtsen, spots where he led the goat and where they rested overnight. Even now, people who have cancer and other serious illnesses come there to drink the water. Many who drink from the spring that Gar Tongtsen once blessed reportedly recover quickly. I was told that my mother carried me there when I was very young. I was seriously ill at the time, and the family had no money for medical treatment. It is said that many children who go there stop getting sick. And those who are already sick can also recover. Locals say that people would come and stay for several days, just to drink that spring water. Whenever I travel through Drango and pass by that spring, I think my life has been sustained because of this spring water. Gar Tongtsen traveled to many places throughout Tibet, including Lagang and Kukutapada Mountain, a place I have also visited. In all those places, there are sites that were blessed by his presence. These are the places blessed by the realized beings of that time. They left some incredible historical symbols for future generations. At that time, the Yokang temple was considered to be on the demoness's chest. The lake was filled and the Jokang temple was built on it. As for all the limbs of the demoness, there were the Yangdul temples and the Thadul temples described here, 8 temples in all. These were built to subdue the demoness and pin her limbs in place. If these 8 temples were built at precisely the right locations, the demoness would not be able to rise. Furthermore, the Dharma could then be present throughout Tibet for ages to come. I think about this. The dependent origination of this place is absolutely inconceivable, and the wisdom eye of these great masters is beyond our ordinary comprehension. Why? Because of what happened to the Dharma in Tibet. I am not praising this simply because I am Tibetan, but everyone should know. Despite the many changes and upheavals over the years, the Dharma in Tibet has never diminished. And it is not merely nominal. There is genuine study, contemplation, and practice in people's hearts, in monasteries, across every corner of Tibet. The entire population embraces the Dharma. Such Dharma brings enormous benefit to the whole world. All of this shows that from the very beginning, the ancient builders understood the terrain with extraordinary precision. The Potala Palace is remarkable. I sometimes think of it as one of the wonders of the ancient world. By contrast, the buildings we construct today may not even last a few decades. Our reinforced concrete and steel deteriorates very quickly. But back then, the ancients built enormous structures on the mountainside, so high, so majestic, so awe-inspiring, and the entire building has never tilted or been damaged. This is remarkable. Something incredibly rare. If you ever have the chance to visit the Potala Palace, observe it carefully from below. It was built entirely from stone and earth, piled up layer by layer. In contrast, will our modern buildings still stand after a few decades, or even 10 odd years? A building we construct here today, even when the carpenter declares there are no problems, can within just 2 years become a hazardous structure. And yet, the Potala has stood for centuries without tilting or crumbling. We all get frightened, worried it might collapse and crush us. When spring comes, we have to start all over and rebuild. But the power of the aspirations of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and their blessings are inconceivable. These are matters worth deep reflection. In short, at that time, Tibet had Buddhist shrines, assembly halls, monasteries, and objects of the 3 jewels. But was there anyone teaching the Dharma? Were there ordained practitioners? There were none. That key spirit and essence of the Dharma was absent. At that time, compared to the era of King Lha-Thothori, the Dharma during this later period was more flourishing. But for it to truly flourish, for great masters to be teaching and for people to be cultivating virtue, that kind of vibrant atmosphere had not yet taken hold. That is what you could say about that era. Then, after another 5 royal generations, Tibet entered the reign of King Trisong Detsen. A period was essentially the same as the Tang dynasty in China. Now, the Tang dynasty in China and the reign of King Songtsen Gampo in Tibet were roughly similar. You could say that. During the Tang dynasty, many Chinese emperors had strong faith in Buddhism, and a significant portion of the population also embraced the Dharma. When you read that history, it is genuinely inspiring. But the time when Buddhism reached its true peak of flourishing in Tibet was during the reign of King Trisong Detsen. That era stands apart. He sent representatives all the way to India to invite the incomparable great Vidyadhara of Udayana, Guru Rinpoche Padmasambhava, the supreme master of secret mantra, unrivaled in the 3 realms. Along with Guru Rinpoche, he also invited approximately 108 pandits. We call these Indian scholars great pandits. They were all brought to Tibet. At that time, there was no openness between nations. Borders were closed, and both communication and travel were very difficult. Yet this was, with regard to India, an extraordinary international exchange. Even today, inviting 100 scholars from another country would involve enormous difficulties. So the cultural exchange during King Trisong Detsen's reign, by modern standards, reflected an extraordinarily open-minded vision. You could say that. At that time, 108 Indian pandits were invited all the way to Tibet. Together, they built the very first monastery in Tibet, Samye, the great unchanging, self-arisen temple, as the primary refuge for the Buddha's body. Samye was the first monastery in all of Tibet. Just as the White Horse Temple in Luoyang was the first in China, Samye was the first in Tibet. The murals inside are quite extraordinary. Vivid and lifelike depictions of the entire journey of Guru Padmasambhava and the Bodhisattva Abbot Shantarakshita coming to Tibet, and of how King Trisong Detsen spread the Dharma and governed the country. These accounts are depicted one by one with remarkable clarity. Samye was also built combining 3 distinct architectural styles and layouts of China, India, and Tibet. The process of construction is described in great detail in the great biography of the great master Padmasambhava and related historical accounts. We have visited Samye, and the monastery itself is not very large, but in terms of blessings and historical significance, it is a place of immense sacred power. Our precious Guru Jigme Phuntsok Rinpoche would often speak about Samye in the context of recalling his own past lives. Our precious Guru would recall his past life as Nanam Dorje Dujom, who served in the presence of Guru Padmasambhava. He would vividly recount how, in that lifetime, he helped propagate the Dharma. It was also at Samye that Guru Padmasambhava taught the art of translation to 108 young Tibetans, including the great translator Vairotsana, training each of them in the precise methods of translation. These great translators translated all of the sutras, tantras, and shastras that were flourishing in the noble land of India, bringing them all into Tibetan. When Master Atisha later traveled to Tibet, he was deeply moved and said, "The sutras and tantras you have in Tibet now, we don't even have all of these in India anymore. Indeed, when I think about it, the entire Kangyo, so many thousands of scriptures, was translated during that era. Many of the major treatises were also translated. The king and his ministers made a rule. No works written by Tibetans could be included in the Kangyur, the collection that holds only the words of the Buddha. They were concerned about the risk of inauthentic teachings being included. Likewise, no Tibetan-authored treatises could be placed in the 218 volumes of the Tengyur. The second part, which contained only treatises. This is an important distinction. In the Tibetan tradition, when we refer to the Kangyur, we mean only the collected scriptures, consisting entirely of the Buddha's own words. The 218 volumes of the Tengyur are commentaries by great Indian scholars. explaining the Buddha's deeper intent. Because in India at that time, the rules for composing shastras were extremely strict. Only those recognized as truly great pandits were qualified to compose commentarial texts. So translating the entire Kangyur and the treatises from India into Tibetan was an undertaking of staggering proportions. But the benefit to Buddhism and all sentient beings is beyond imagination. Then, to determine whether Tibet could have ordained practitioners, 7 candidates were selected for a trial ordination, including the great translator Vairotsana and others. These 7 were the first to try to be ordained, and the attempt was a success. Thus they established the Sangha, the refuge of the Buddha's mind, the third of the 3 jewels. From then on, Buddhism flourished like the rising sun. Despite many ups and downs during this period, it continues to flourish today. It went through periods such as when the Mara king Langdharma destroyed Buddhism. There were many such experiences. Especially later on, the setbacks were even more serious. But in fact, the Dharma of scripture and the Dharma of realization of the Tathagata have never declined and have continued to increase. Thus, Tibet can be considered a true and genuine Buddhist central land. Some practitioners may not have been born in Tibet, but since they are studying the Dharma in Tibet, this is essentially no different from being born in Tibet. Some practitioners come from families that do not follow Buddhism at all, but made their way to a monastery on their own. This too can be counted as having been born in the central land with a favorable environment. Otherwise, especially if your family is actively opposed to the Dharma, things can be extremely difficult. If your family does not practice Buddhism, and that counts as being in a border region, some people might wonder whether they are missing one of the 10 advantages. For most people, even though you have been ordained for many years, you may still have to conceal your practice from your family. Some family members even write letters to the authorities, implicating their own relatives and saying they are a bad person, going to such extremes. Sometimes these family members are in a pitiable state. They do not have faith in Buddhism themselves, and they use all kinds of means to undermine their own children. They also try to damage Buddhist communities by various methods. Today, I read a letter written by a practitioner's family member and sent to certain authorities. It is sad that some people are in such a state, but there is nothing that can be done. Those family members are already completely bound by their own karma. So whether each of us has been born in a border region or a Buddhist central land is something each person needs to examine. If many people are practicing the Dharma there, you are living where the Dharma is flourishing. Then the place where you currently live is considered a central land. So we need to observe and think carefully about all these conditions. In conclusion, a place where the Dharma genuinely flourishes is the kind of place where one should choose to make a permanent home. And this is very important. Ordinary people, even those who have been ordained for years or who have taken lay precepts, may gradually be influenced and shaped by their family, environment, cultural background, or various other factors. Over time, little by little, you may drift away and become a non-Buddhist. This is a very real danger. I sincerely hope that every single Buddhist practitioner should first choose their Dharma companions and living environment carefully. And this is genuinely crucial. Some fellow practitioners at our institute frequently ask to take leave to go back home. Of course, that is understandable. But I am genuinely worried that once you go back, you might never return. Because the environment around you, the people you live among, are largely indifferent to Buddhism, or may even slander it. And our own meditative stability is still quite unreliable, even though you may have temporarily given rise to renunciation and felt the blessings of the 3 jewels, and a single moment of virtuous thought has arisen in you. Such a virtuous thought can easily be obscured by dark clouds. So even though life here might have some hardships, and your health might fluctuate, unless there is something urgent, it is best to stay in a place where the Dharma flourishes, and to stay as long as you possibly can. Thank you.
Sonandai Tancha Thogaya Thönmi Sambhota Jirgana Jirano Chukai Chupun Sonen Droa Droa
Padma Sadarda Om Bandharangara Padma Sada Om Bandharangara Padma Sadarda